Okay. Hi, Sarah. How are you today?
Great. Looking forward to recording another episode of Appraisal Basics with you.
Me too. Yeah. This is our series where we talk about foundational principles of appraising, and hopefully of use to new appraisers. And if you're not a new appraiser, hopefully it's just entertainment. I guess, but we'll see. Um, I guess. Well, today we were going to talk about like such an important thing, something that we could actually probably spend episode after episode after episode talking about, but we're going to try and condense it all down, bite-sized form. We're going to talk about how to write a comparable analysis. You know, the probably the single most important, possibly the single most important part of the appraisal report. Um, and the way that I conceptualize this, and we talked a little bit about, we hit record. You know, it's not everyone will do it this way or needs to do it this way, but this is just how I conceptualize my thinking. And the reason that I like it, well, it's an outline, right? That I can't take credit for it, by the way. This is something that I just kind of pieced together over time, and certainly other people uh, are more responsible for this. But I think it's important to share. Um, and I don't know. Should we just jump right in?
Absolutely. Yeah. And having an outline, it just gives you the structure you need to make sure that you're accomplishing all the important parts.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I find that it helps structure your thinking. You know, even if you think about things in terms of outlines, it helps you think what before you even start. It helps you kind of know the place you need to get to. It helps maybe guide some of your research before you get to the point where you're ready to sit down and write the analysis. And it's just good all around.
There are many ways through this. We're not saying this is the only way, but this can be a really helpful outline for structuring your thinking when you're doing your appraisal research. And then when you get to that part, which is a really important part of an appraisal report where you're writing the comparable analysis for the item you're appraising, just how, it's all in your brain, but how do you get it out of your brain and organized in a way that the intended users of the appraisal report are going to be able to understand? And it's really important to remember your reader because they may have zero art history knowledge, zero antique knowledge, how to structure this in a way that they're going to be able to read it and go, oh, I get why the appraiser arrived at this appraised fair market value or appraised retail replacement value, whatever the intended use is.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah. So never forget that you're writing for an audience that might know nothing about the topic at hand. Um, so this is why, I'm gonna just change slides here. We're gonna look at the first paragraph of your comparable analysis narrative, and this is where you just want to introduce the subject property. So in just and don't be too flowery. Just be very direct and concise. You want to get the reader acquainted with the subject property. Who's the artist or the designer, as the case may be. What's the title? When was it made? But also, all you want to talk about points of interest and maybe tie it back to trends that maybe you had mentioned in the market analysis, or maybe kind of contextualize it in the artist's body of work. You're just kind of introducing it. There's but Sarah, I mean, not everyone will. This is not a natural choice for everyone. This is again, this is just how I organize my thinking. But some people will accomplish this in a different way. Um, they will, like we were talking about before we were recording. Um,
Yeah. And yeah, because ostensibly when the item is cataloged and it has its, the artist, the title, it's cataloging the photographs, a lot of this information has already been introduced. And so, there's an argument to be made. Well, it's there, people can read it there. But what I like to do is refer back to that. You already have that foundation of the cataloging information, but this paragraph one is really the chance to just refresh the reader, say, this is the piece, and this is we're about to launch into why how this piece is relative, similar or not similar to the comparables that are going to be introduced. So it's just very clear for the reader. And this is not the place to have 8 paragraphs about the artist's career. This
Hmm.
is
Hmm.
not, it's concise. Being concise is great. And also, as you said, it does, flowery language is not really what is needed here. Like as appraisers, we're objective. We're doing our job. So this is not, this is the most magnificent painting I've ever seen. It's, we're using objective
Hmm.
language because this is really an analyzing the piece we're praising relative to these comparables were selected and saying, why did we select them? And how, really presenting our argument.
Absolutely, yeah. And this is how we're starting. This is ground zero. Um, and yeah, and then so from here, once you're kind of introducing the reader to this, um, what's your second paragraph? You're just moving on to really the essential task. You've already done your research, right? At this point that you're writing the comparable narrative, the comparable analysis, and you've already narrowed it down to your most relevant comps. This is where you that now in prose you're explaining to the reader, you're introducing them to the first comparable. Um, every everyone kind of has a different way they like to order the comparables, and some people can be very dogmatic about that. Some people always go in reverse chronological order. Some people always list them, what they feel is the best comparable first. Other people might do it in reverse, go from the sort of have the last one be the strongest one, kind of like the mic drop at the end. Um, I don't. Yeah, I think it. I think reverse chronological order is kind of what I would lean towards, but everyone kind of does that a little differently. Um, and the reason, when we're talking about chronological order, that's the referring to the date of the completed sale of that comparable, because you always want to pay attention to the dates of sales of the comparables in relation to the effective valuation date of your appraisal report. That's a really important thing. Um, as we know, the appraisal is really only interested in the market at that little slice of time, that window of time, the effective valuation date. Um, and the market changes over time. So the greater the distance between your effective valuation date and the date of sale of a comparable, the more work you have to do to kind of explain to the reader, to kind of bridge the gap between the state of the market at that time. Um, and I don't want to ramble on this point, but it's like you always want to circle back. You always want to make sure that the reader understands, that you're explaining this stuff to the reader. Um, so with that in mind, you're introducing comparable one, and you're just discussing the similarities and differences between the two properties. Which one is larger, which one has a nicer, if it's a painting, a better composition, or if it's furniture, what has nicer craftsmanship. And you're using your knowledge of the market, your connoisseurship, and you're explaining to the reader which one is better, which one is more desirable. In other words, and you have the sale, the amount of comparable one, and so you're based on that information. Which one is better, the comparable or the subject property? Which one would be worth more? So you're starting to begin triangulating in on the value that you're going to conclude.
Exactly. Yeah, the adjustments, whether it's upwards, downwards, how much, which factors are the ones that are driving those adjustments. And back to remember the reader can be really hard as appraisers because we understand all these things with our connoisseurship knowledge. And so figuring out how to explain them in a way that someone who may have absolutely no previous experience with art or antiques or appraising, picturing a random person on the street, how can you explain this to them in a way that's going to make sense to them? We in our mind often we're writing for other appraisers, but those most of the time other appraisers are not the audience that's actually reading this. So it's really, really important to translate our connoisseurship into something that is very clear and approachable for a non-specialist audience.
Absolutely, absolutely. That is key, for sure. Um, and as you can imagine, you're kind of, as you begin to accumulate these, you're taking this sort of structure here and you're kind of repeating it, right? So I'm going to move on to paragraph 3, which is really the same kind of this same treatment, right? But you're just moving on to the next comparable, right? So you kind of, you examined comparable 1 there in paragraph 2 in relation to the subject property, and you made a conclusion, right? And now you're doing the same thing in with the next comparable. You're kind of repeating that structure, and again, you're making a sort of a judgment about the relative value of the subject work in relation to this market fact, this sale that you found in your research.
Mhm.
Um, and yeah,
And this can really be a very supportive structure for writing appraisal reports because you just plug into this outline that's organized your thinking, organized your research, and it's also organized how you write your explanation to support this.
absolutely, absolutely. And there's always going to be exceptions to this rule. This is just like the most basic example you could think of. There's going to be so many complicated exceptions, to any kind of, this is not a formula for one size fits all, but this is just, how I prefer to structure my thinking. And again, this is not, I did not come up with this. A lot of you know me. I was previously on staff at the Appraisers Association. I and over the years, this was, this I kind of accumulated this from just kind of feedback from sort of, real veterans in the field. They would kind of, this is one way that they would kind of help point people in the right direction. And it's just a healthy um, exercise, I think.
Mhm.
Um, and I'm just moving on here. Next slide. I mean, again, you're just kind of repeating this kind of structure. You're introducing the third comparable, and again, comparing and contrasting the subject property, to this, which one, ultimately with a mind of which one is more desirable in the market, and why. That's all very important.
Yeah. And then at this point, it's really getting clear to anyone reading through it. Like, okay, I see where we're going with this story. What's the ending going to be?
Exactly. Yeah, you're leaving those breadcrumbs right along the way. You're making those sort of initial judgments, and those come back into play really in the conclusion, right? So if you summarize what those were, because it's a better piece than comparable 1, because it's about the same as comparable 2, because comparable 4 would be better than this subject 1. You're able to kind of zero in on what the value is and where this item sits in the market, and that's how you're really determining. Um, this is how I like to conceive of it. This outline helps me make those conclusions and structure the thinking. And this is where you're going to conclude by really stating your value. There's every once in a while, I think people will have their actual number in a different place. But I think it's important to, lay that out and say, therefore, the value of the subject property would be X, and that was justified for these reasons I just said.
Exactly. And then in reading the previous 4 paragraphs, the reader knows exactly how you as the appraiser arrived there, what you're using to support it. And if you've done your job well, they're like, oh, yeah, that's absolutely right.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I mean, the idea is, as a whole, you're bringing the reader with you. That's, think of it as, I mean, it's a radical idea, maybe to say this out loud. It sounds a little ridiculous, but, this is like a form of literature. This is like a genre of writing, appraisal. It's a highly specialized um, form of, I guess, technical writing in the art world or decorative arts or whatever your particular area is. You're introducing the property, you're comparing it to one thing, you're comparing it to another, you're comparing it to another, and you're drawing conclusions from those comparisons. You're bringing the reader with you. That's why it's so important to explain what you're doing. You have to bring the reader with you, and so by the time you can get to that concluding net value, they are, they're convinced.
Mhm.
They're convinced. Don't forget that the job, our job as an appraiser, it's not, the outcome is not self-evident. It might be, if it's a relatively straightforward assignment, it might feel self-evident to you as an expert, But don't, this is a huge part. You're explaining it to the person. You're making a case. You're convincing somebody.
Yes, the translation and the successfully closing that argument is part of our job.
Absolutely, absolutely. Um, and this is, I'm no under no illusions here that this is, a sort of template that everyone would be, just adopting. It's certainly not a rule or anything. It just, I just find it to be a helpful tool, and would love to hear, any questions from anyone, especially anyone out there who might feel they want some more guidance because artifactual history appraisal, we have, you know, one of our services is our appraisal review service, and I think people are used to thinking of appraisal review as maybe a sort of reappraisal of a pre-existing work. But USPAP does say that appraisers have sort of broad leeway in kind of determining what a review is or what the scope is of a review. And for us, that's really focused on a sort of coaching and an educational thing. So it's, if you're interested in any of that, do drop us a line, at artific at, that's my email, pmcintyre@afhappraisal.com. um,
Yeah. And I'm so happy that you've introduced this service and you're leading it because you're phenomenal at it. And yeah, it's not, as we spoken about in other contexts, appraisal review isn't, as we conceptualize it, something that's punitive. It's not, you're in trouble. This is really positive professional development. So that's something where you're looking for more, please reach out to Patrick.
yeah, we hope to hear from you soon. And that's our brief little nugget of video fun for today. um,
Soon for the next installment.
yes, we'll see you all soon.